My big idea is about blind spotting, which is exploring things that can be hard to see. Many people see that we have two possible futures, and the one we're heading for is not the one we want. Few people see that the way we've been trying to change follows a way of thinking that hasn't worked because it can't. I want to offer another possible way that hasn't yet been tried. It could be worth a try. Many things feel like progress. Meeting amazing people here at Bradford University, having a phone that's smarter than I am. But other things, like climate and population and people going hungry, feel like progress in reverse. Despite all efforts, over more than 40 years, the world is becoming dramatically less and not more sustainable. As global challenges get bigger, we should be responding from a bigger imaginative space, using thinking that's bigger. What I mostly see, though, is the opposite. I blame this guy. Almost 400 years ago, René Descartes described a method of tackling problems by dividing them into smaller parts. His method of reductionism became the template for how we think about everything. It has enabled us to be so collectively intelligent, to build an advanced civilization, but also collectively so stupid, to bring that civilization ever closer to the point of collapse. It shows us, for example, how to grow food by focusing on parts like fertilizers and pesticides, but it can't show us how to grow food by caring for the soil as an ecology. So soils are depleted worldwide. The problems that are caused by reductionism cannot be solved by this same way of thinking. The other way of seeing the world is where all the parts are intertwined like in a big ball of wool. Everything is connected to everything else. This has been known as the first law of ecology since the 1970s. However, considering this much complexity is very challenging because every problem, every aspect of every problem is connected to every other aspect. If the individual problems already seem overwhelmingly difficult, then what's it feel like to consider them all merged together into one planet-scale problem? Our instinctive response to this is shrinking thinking, responding to complexity by withdrawing from it. The most extreme form of shrinking thinking is the ostrich position. Thinking shrinks to the point where problems just appear to vanish. My life is complicated enough already, so don't talk to me about climate change or Syria or anything scary. This position, the ostrich position, also applies when we see that there's a problem, but it's not very serious, and we can't do anything about it. And anyway, it's too late. So what about those of us who don't have our heads in the sand? Our shrinking thinking is represented by this swan struggling to take flight. From this perspective, I'm busy taking action, setting targets, raising awareness, trying to reduce impact in my area of interest. I find that what I can do is limited, but I believe that my actions have a ripple effect that spreads toward global change. Millions of others have believed this also for decades, and it hasn't solved the problems, so we just keep struggling. The ostrich position sees no complexity. Beyond that, the swan struggles with some pieces of complexity. But what lies beyond the swan's position? There is an enormous blind spot. This blind spot is the possibility of working with global complexity as an undivided whole. This has been omitted as a possibility from every major agenda ever since the first talks on global problems. Our psychology, thinking, expertise, institutions, and funding all tell us that this is a dead end. Despite all this, it's not a dead end, and we can show it on this map, so it doesn't have to be a blind spot. Here's the ostrich at one extreme. Here's the swan struggling to get a big shift within its limited focus. Rather than escaping these limits, the swan is turned towards the ostrich. Look, here's some more evidence. There really is a problem. By turning around, the swan could fly into the planet-sized imaginative space, and the opposite extreme. Here we can unshrink our thinking. We can find a method of whole system change that's big enough and fast enough. Let's look at how to do this in practice. Archimedes talked about being able to move the earth if he had enough leverage. Donella Meadows talked about a lever as a small change that creates a big shift in a complex system. She meant that some things like money or mindsets are so deeply connected into the way the world works that changing them can change everything. These fish understand leverage. When they see a large toothy risk heading towards them, they can change direction in an instant. We humans can observe large risk for decades and yet remain locked into the same thinking and the same direction. And yet this is optional. We could turn around at any time. From our whole system perspective, we can find where the complexity could be switched from causing to solving a lot of problems. This choice of making or not making this switch is what I call a planet lever. So planet levers have just two positions. They either unlock positive change or they reinforce reverse progress. I propose a set of 7 planet levers to get fast, global, whole system change. 20 years of climate talks have aimed to cut emissions, while the emissions, inconveniently, just keep rising. The talks never mention that climate security actually requires cutting carbon concentrations, not just emissions. They don't say that the climate problem is inseparable from other global problems, and that solving them all offers possibilities both for cutting concentrations and for keeping an economic growth, which is the little bit that politicians worry about whenever they're failing to act year after year. So climate security is inseparable from other aspects of security. They will all be gained or lost together. This merged, from our whole system perspective, we share just one overall goal that I call global security. Planet Lever 1 is to get global security by aiming to reverse all global problems. Our shrinking thinking can cause global problems, but cannot solve them. But where does shrinking thinking come from? It's not planned by education systems, it's not in any curriculum, but it is embedded in our centralized methods of teaching. A world of knowledge is divided into a series of tiny pieces and fed into young minds for the purpose of later being brought up by tests. Planet Lever 2 is to switch from learning what we're told to learning what we're curious about. This means that the choice of what to learn next responds both to the curriculum and to the curiosity of the group, including teachers. Curiosity-led learning means that people stay engaged so they learn better. It means that our innate enthusiasms for exploring, asking questions, and joining up ideas continues to be built rather than dismantled. Planet Lever 3 tackles the patterns of consumerism, resource depletion, and the dumping of waste into the air, land, and water worldwide. Rather than trying to deal with these symptoms of all these problems separately, we can switch the economy from its overall linear pattern to a circular economy, where all resources end up again as new resources for people or for nature, and not as accumulating waste. The idea of linear economy has been around for almost 50 years without happening for real, and yet it could be made to happen everywhere very quickly. The linear economy has product prices that completely ignore the risk of things becoming waste. The circular economy, when it happens, will have product prices that include the risk of things becoming waste. This will minimize future prices, and it will transform markets and economic growth from ecological villains to ecological heroes. How should nations seek security and prevent suffering? The current approach takes us ever further from a world of peace. In 2012, the global cost of military was $2.4 trillion. The global cost of violence was $9.5 trillion. I'm guessing you could think of better uses for this money. The goal of achieving security by minimizing weapons spending was written into the founding articles of the United Nations in 1945, but it has never been done. My proposal to do it for real now has been published by NATO. Planet Lever 4 is to replace gross domestic product with gross peaceful product. Gross peaceful product is just GDP that doesn't count weapons spending. Nations could still spend what they chose on military, but politicians, in order to maximize their economic growth, would now choose to shift funds from preparing for conflict to preventing the causes of conflict. This makes global security both affordable and achievable. Despite all conservation efforts, over the past 40 years and more, people continue to degrade and devour the world's natural capital, such as healthy soils, forests, and biodiversity. The underlying cause is our relationship with nature, defined by ownership of fragments of the Earth's surface, and expressed by this voice calling out around the world, "It's mine." We don't need to end the idea of ownership, but we must end the commodification of nature. We can bring into modern culture the ancient indigenous view that we belong to the Earth and not the other way around. Planet Lever 5 is an international treaty to interpret all ownership of the Earth's surface as including a duty of guardianship. Owners would be expected to preserve and care for the natural capital. Those who instead remove it, which is called ecocide, would no longer be able to manage what they own. Those who care for it would continue to benefit from the abundance of nature. The World Economic Forum say that inequality is one of the biggest global risks. The world's richest 85 people now own more than the poorest 3.5 billion. This ridiculous inequality is also one of the biggest global opportunities. Planet Lever 6 is peer-led philanthropy by the mega-rich. They must redirect their surplus accumulated wealth into resolving the world's accumulated problems. If they don't, then they will be hit by the same systems collapse as the rest of us, and their wealth will become meaningless. This won't happen automatically. Governments will need to push it, for example, by taxing speculation and ending tax havens. The public will need to push governments. Doug and Chris Tompkins here are among those who are leading this shift by conserving more than 2 million acres of forest. Doug asks, what if the richest 10,000 people would do what I did? Many of us have experienced cuts to local services or other impacts of austerity. And yet austerity is just a political choice that comes from allowing almost all money to be supplied into the economy as debt to banks. This is the reason why debts of all kinds continue to increase. Planet Lever 7 is to switch the right to create money from private banks to public-owned and public accountable bodies. Money could then be created simply by spending it into the real economy. Lever 7 would also benefit banks, who would lose the disastrous casino mindset that comes with them being left in charge of the money tree. Today, civilization remains locked into reverse progress. But this is optional. The planet levers are ready to use now. If we're quick, we could still have a positive future. But what if we just start with some movement of some of the levers? This would still be shrinking thinking. The levers are all connected, like levers in a lock. So some movement means the whole system stays locked. We must move them all, and moving them all might be easier than we fear. After the levers are moved, we'll see change far beyond what is today imaginable and possible. We'll see ostriches with their heads up and swans flying everywhere. Let's make this happen. Thank you very much.